I walked into my house and found my late wife's portrait removed from the wall. My daughter-in-law said, "We're redecorating. She's not part of this family anymore." My son shrugged, "It's just a picture." I left without a word, but what she didn't know was that in removing her, she had just triggered a clause in the will that would. I had lived in that house for 37 years. Not just lived, built a life into its walls. Every creak in the hardwood, every faint stain on the ceiling, every crooked nail hidden behind framed photographs told a story I could recite without thinking. It was the kind of place that didn't just shelter you, it remembered you. My wife, Alina, used to say the house had a soul. She believed that memories settled into spaces the way dust did, quietly, invisibly, until one day you realized they were everywhere. She passed away 6 years ago. Cancer, slow, methodical, and cruel in a way that felt almost deliberate. It didn't take her all at once. It peeled her away from me piece by piece, until the woman who used to hum in the kitchen while making coffee was reduced to a quiet presence in a hospital bed, her hand always searching for mine, even when she could no longer speak. After she was gone, the house became still. Not empty, never empty, just quieter in a way that made every memory louder. I kept things the way she left them for a long time. Her books stayed on the nightstand, her favorite mug remained in the cabinet, slightly chipped along the rim, and her portrait, hung in the living room just above the fireplace. It was a simple oil painting, commissioned for our 25th anniversary. She had protested the idea at first, said it was too grand for people like us, but when the artist finished, even she had to admit it captured something real, not just her face but her warmth, her steadiness. That portrait wasn't decoration. It was presence. My son, Daniel, used to understand that. He grew up in that house after all. He knew what it meant, or at least I believed he did. Daniel had always been practical. Even as a boy, he wasn't sentimental the way his mother was. Where Alina saw meaning, Daniel saw function. Where she held onto things, he learned early how to let go. It wasn't a flaw, just a difference. When he married Clea, I noticed something shift. Clea had a way of entering a room and subtly rearranging it, not always physically, but socially, emotionally. Conversations bent around her. Decisions seemed to drift in her direction. She was polite, always smiling, always saying the right things, but there was a firmness underneath it, a quiet insistence. At first, I told myself that was good for Daniel. He had always needed someone decisive. And for a while, things were fine. They visited often. Holidays were still held at the house. Clea would bring wine, Daniel would help me with small repairs, and for a few hours, it almost felt like things hadn't changed. But over time, their visits became different. Shorter, more transactional. Clea started making comments, not overtly critical, but edged with suggestion. "You know, this place could really use some updating. Have you ever thought about modernizing the living room? It's a beautiful house, but it feels a bit frozen in time." Frozen. That was the word she used. I suppose in her eyes she wasn't wrong. I hadn't changed much. The furniture was the same, the layout untouched. Even the paint on the walls remained the soft, warm tones Alina had chosen decades ago. Because to me, it wasn't outdated. It was intact. Still, I said nothing. Just nodded, the way you do when someone younger believes they're offering wisdom you've somehow missed. Then, 3 years ago, I made a decision. A practical one. The house was large, too large for one person if you looked at it objectively. Maintenance alone was becoming more than I cared to manage. And Daniel, well, he and Clea had started talking about needing more space. So I offered it to them. Not as a gift, exactly. There were conditions, legal ones, carefully constructed with the help of a lawyer who understood both property law and human nature better than most. But to Daniel, it was simple. "Are you sure, Dad?" he asked at the time. "This is your home." "It's still family," I told him. "That's what matters." And I meant it. I moved into a smaller place across town, a quiet, manageable house with just enough space for what I needed. I brought some things with me, clothes, a few personal items, but I left most of it behind. Including the portrait. Because that's where it belonged. Daniel and Clea moved in within a month. At first they were respectful, careful even. They didn't rush into changes. They asked permission before moving larger pieces of furniture. Clea kept her suggestions to a minimum. But time has a way of revealing people's true intentions. Little things started to shift. A chair replaced here, a rug swapped out there, new paint in the guest room, then the hallway. Each change was small, reasonable. Individually, none of them felt worth questioning. But together, they began to alter the house in a way that felt less like evolution and more like erasure. Still, I said nothing. Because it was their home now. At least, that's what I told myself. I visited less often after that, not out of anger, just discomfort I couldn't quite explain. Each visit felt like stepping into a place that looked familiar but no longer recognized me in return. Daniel didn't seem to notice. Clea, on the other hand, noticed everything. Especially what remained unchanged. And that portrait, Alina's portrait, remained exactly where it had always been. Scented, untouched. Watching. Waiting. I didn't know it then, but that painting was more than memory. It was a boundary. And some boundaries, once crossed, don't just cause conflict. They trigger consequences. It happened on a Tuesday. There was nothing remarkable about the day itself. No storm rolling in, no strange feeling in the air, no warning that anything was about to shift. Just a quiet afternoon, the kind that blends into every other when you've reached a certain age and rhythm. I hadn't planned to visit. In fact, I rarely did anymore, not because I wasn't welcome, at least not explicitly, but because I had learned to recognize when a place no longer feels like it belongs to you. You can still enter it, still sit in its rooms, still be offered coffee at the same kitchen table, but something underneath has changed. That day, though, I found myself driving there without much thought. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was something quieter, harder to name. Or maybe it was Alina. The house looked different the moment I pulled into the driveway. Cleaner in a way that didn't feel natural. The shrubs had been trimmed into sharper lines. The old wooden bench Alina loved, the one she insisted on keeping despite the slight crack along its side, was gone. In its place sat something newer, sleeker, impersonal. I sat in the car for a moment longer than necessary, studying the front door like it might offer some explanation. Then I got out. I still had a key. That at least hadn't changed. The lock turned easily, the familiar click echoing in a way that felt louder than it should have. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not bad, just different. Gone was the faint mix of coffee and old wood, and whatever subtle perfume Alina used to favor. In its place was something artificial, clean in a manufactured way, like a hotel room trying too hard to feel welcoming. "Daniel," I called out. No answer. I stepped further inside, closing the door behind me. The living room came into view slowly, piece by piece, as it always had. The angle of the hallway hadn't changed. The light still filtered through the same windows, but the furniture rearranged. The couch was gone, replaced with something modern and low. The armchair I used to sit in, my chair, was nowhere to be seen. The rug had changed, the coffee table, even the lamps. It wasn't my living room anymore. And yet I kept walking. Because there was one thing I expected to see. One thing that had never changed, no matter how much Clea had suggested it might. The fireplace came into full view. And I stopped. The wall above it was empty. Not partially rearranged, not shifted. Empty. For a moment, I genuinely thought I was mistaken, that I had walked into the wrong angle, that the light was playing some trick on my eyes. My mind tried to correct what it was seeing, to place the portrait back where it belonged. But it wasn't there. The space where Alina had hung for decades, where her presence had anchored the entire room, was just blank. No mark, no placeholder, nothing to suggest anything had ever been there at all. I didn't feel anger right away. Just a kind of stillness. A quiet, precise awareness that something irreversible had just happened. "Ars, you're here." Clea's voice came from behind me. I turned slowly. She stood near the hallway entrance, phone in hand, dressed casually but with that same deliberate neatness she always carried. She smiled, the way she always did, polite, controlled, just warm enough to pass for genuine. "I didn't expect you today," she said. I looked back at the wall, then at her. "The portrait," I said. Not a question, just a statement. She followed my gaze, then gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something minor. "Oh, that," she said lightly. "We took it down." "We? Where is it?" I asked. "In storage for now," she replied, her tone even, almost dismissive. "We're redecorating." Redecorating. The word hung in the air like it was supposed to explain everything. I turned fully toward her then, studying her face for something: hesitation, uncertainty, even the slightest hint that she understood what she had done. There was none. Instead, she stepped a little closer, gesturing vaguely toward the room. "You have to admit the space feels much more open now," she continued. "Cleaner, more current." Current. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make it uncomfortable. "That was my wife," I said. Claire's smile didn't disappear, it just adjusted. "Yes, of course," she said quickly, "and we respect that, truly, but this is our home now, and we're trying to create something that reflects us." Us? She said it like it was a reasonable equation, like removing Alina from the wall was just part of balancing it. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "She's not really part of this family anymore." The sentence landed cleanly. No hesitation, no malice in her tone. Just certainty. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just precisely. Behind her I heard footsteps. Daniel. He entered the room with the same casual ease he always had, though there was a flicker of surprise when he saw me standing there. "Hey Dad," he said, "didn't know you were coming by." I nodded once. "Daniel," I said, "the portrait." He glanced at the wall, then at Claire, then back at me. For a brief moment I saw it, that hesitation, that awareness that something about this wasn't quite right. And then it passed. He shrugged. "It's just a picture," he said. Just a picture. There are moments in life when words reveal more than actions ever could. That was one of them. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and realized that whatever understanding we once shared about that house, about Alina, about what certain things meant, it was gone. Not stolen. Given away. I nodded again, slowly this time. "Of course," I said. Neither of them noticed the change in my voice. Or if they did, they didn't recognize what it meant. I took one last look at the empty wall. Then I turned and walked toward the door. "Dad," Daniel called after me, "you're leaving already." I didn't stop. Didn't turn around. Didn't raise my voice. "I'll be in touch," I said. And then I stepped outside, closing the door behind me with a quiet finality that neither of them understood. Not yet. Because what Claire didn't know, what neither of them knew, was that the house had never truly stopped belonging to Alina. And in removing her, they hadn't just redecorated. They had activated something. I didn't go home after that visit. Not immediately. I drove around the city, letting the streets swallow me, letting the familiar lights and sounds blur into one continuous hum. My mind wasn't on the traffic, or the occasional honk, or the smell of exhaust and fried food from some diner down the block. It was on the portrait, on Alina, on what had just happened, and on what was about to happen. For the first time in years, I felt that old, cold dread of loss, not the kind that comes when someone dies, but the kind that comes when something sacred is desecrated in front of you. That feeling where the world itself has shifted slightly, imperceptibly, and you're the only one who notices. The legal documents had been carefully drafted years earlier, during a time when Daniel and I were still talking about passing the house on in a responsible, orderly way. I had anticipated that someday I might want to maintain control over certain parts of the estate, especially the sections tied to Alina. I had anticipated that people would forget, or misunderstand, or even try to push boundaries, but I hadn't anticipated the speed with which someone would act. I remembered the clause clearly. It was precise, meticulously written, the kind of detail you only include if you expect someone to test it. If any item or representation of Alina Whittaker, living, deceased, or artistic, is removed from its designated location in the primary residence without the express written consent of the executor, the inheritance allocated to the resident shall immediately revert to the surviving spouse or direct descendant of Alina Whittaker, as determined by the executor. Executor, that was me. I felt the familiar chill of power settle in. They thought it was just a picture. They didn't understand that the portrait wasn't just decoration, it was a binding token, a symbol, and legally it was far more than that. By removing it, Claire hadn't just crossed a line. She had tripped a trap that had been lying dormant for years, waiting for someone like her. I called my lawyer from the car, the one who had drafted the will with me. I didn't even bother making small talk, I just stated the facts. They removed the portrait. She's gone from the wall, I said. There was a long pause on the other end. Yes, the lawyer said finally. That triggers the clause immediately. The house, and any liquid assets tied to it, are under your control again. You don't need a court order. They've effectively forfeited their claim. I hung up the phone and drove to the house. Slowly, deliberately. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even in a hurry. But the thought of entering that space, the place where my wife's presence had been mocked and trivialized, gave me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. When I arrived, I parked a few blocks away. I didn't rush to the door. I watched the house instead, noting the movement inside. Claire was there, organizing what she clearly thought was a new era. Daniel looked awkward, hovering somewhere behind her, probably trying to mediate, probably already realizing that he didn't fully understand what was happening. I let them work. I let them think they had the advantage. Then I entered. The door opened easily. My key still worked, of course. I stepped in quietly, not announcing my presence, letting the air itself seem to acknowledge my return. The house smelled the same as it had for decades, a mix of Alina's memory and the faint traces of Claire's attempts to modernize. I didn't speak, I didn't gesture, I simply walked. Every step was measured, every turn deliberate. I went from room to room, observing the changes, cataloging them. The rug that was new, the furniture that didn't belong, the walls she had painted in sterile shades meant to erase warmth, and the empty space above the fireplace. I stopped there and I smiled quietly, not a smile of amusement, not of mockery, but the kind of smile that only comes when you know something they do not, a smile of inevitability. I didn't tell them yet, not aloud, not directly, not until I was ready. Instead, I let the knowledge seep into the house like a shadow. Every movement they made, every step they took, was now under the quiet weight of their mistake. They didn't know it yet, but their actions had consequences that were immediate, binding, and irreversible. And consequences, unlike emotions, don't forget. That night I left the house again, returning to my small apartment across town. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't, not out of anxiety or anger or revenge, but out of anticipation, because I knew that the moment I acted next, the dynamics inside that house would shift permanently. By morning, emails had been sent, notifications prepared, legal documents ready, notices drafted with precision, every contingency planned, every escape route accounted for. The trap that had lain dormant for years had been tripped, and now the pieces were moving in their own momentum. I was no longer just a father visiting his son. I was a force quietly reclaiming what had always belonged to Alina. And the thought of Claire, so certain in her control, so smug in her redesign, never suspecting that she had just sealed her own fate. That thought was almost intoxicating. I would have to be careful, methodical, patient, the kind of patience Alina herself had always admired in me. Every step had to be precise, every word, every movement calculated to ensure the ultimate outcome. And the fallout was going to be spectacular. Not loud, not messy, perfectly clean, perfectly justified. Because justice, like law, has no need for theatrics, it only needs patience. The days after that visit were strangely calm, almost deceivingly so. I returned to my small apartment and settled into a rhythm that was almost meditative. Each morning I woke early, made coffee the way Alina used to like it, strong, with just a hint of cream, and then sat at my small kitchen table reviewing documents. Trusts, deeds, property titles, clauses, conditions, contingencies. I pored over every legal line I had drafted years ago, the kind of lines designed to catch someone like Claire, polite enough to seem normal, yet rigid, ironclad, and utterly unforgiving if misused. I realized during those quiet mornings how powerful patience can be. It isn't passive, it's active, it's strategy, and I had decades of it embedded in my very nature. Claire had moved too quickly, thinking she could bend my son and me to her designs without consequences. She had underestimated how carefully Alina and I had structured everything. I started planning, not a reaction, but a blueprint. Step 1, assess the terrain. I needed to know every change she had made, every modification to the house. I couldn't just reclaim the portrait symbolically. I had to leverage her own actions to their maximum effect. The empty space above the fireplace was perfect, but it was only the beginning. I requested the house keys from Daniel, not because I needed permission, but because it would look casual. He didn't refuse, he never did. Claire didn't know, but by the time I stepped inside again, I could already see their misstep. By modernizing, by erasing Alina's presence in their eyes, they had created openings. Openings for contracts to activate, assets to shift, and influence to revert. Step 2. Prepare legal contingencies. I worked with my lawyer to ensure that every clause in the will tied directly to the property would activate without contest. For example, the clause about removal of artistic representations of Alina wasn't limited to paintings. It included sculptures, photographs, framed sketches, even digital reproductions displayed publicly in the house. Each one triggered a chain reaction if removed improperly. Claire had no idea she had just unlocked an entire cascade of legal repercussions. Step 3. Psychological leverage. Claire thought she was the architect of this house now, that she had imposed control, but the truth was her control was superficial. Her confidence, her modern aesthetic, even her subtle manipulations of Daniel, all of that could be weaponized against her. She would act naturally, predictably, unaware that each decision she made could feed into my strategy. Step 4. Prepare communication. Carefully worded letters, emails, notices, and formal letters to Daniel and Claire were drafted, reviewed, and perfected. They were designed to sound benign, almost mundane. Nothing overt, nothing that would trigger suspicion. But each one served a dual purpose: establishing the legal basis for action, and psychologically reinforcing their own miscalculation. Step 5. Reclaim the narrative. By the time I made any move, I would not be responding emotionally, I would be in control. Claire believed she was controlling the house, the aesthetic, the family narrative. She thought she could erase Alina and replace her with her current vision. But I would redefine what current meant quietly and irrevocably before she even realized it. During this period, I also reflected on Alina, not just her memory, but her values, her quiet intelligence, her sense of justice. She had been patient with me for years, but she also believed in holding people accountable. That's the principle I had decided to follow. This wasn't about anger or spite. It wasn't about humiliation for its own sake. It was about poetic justice. It was about restoring the equilibrium that Claire had thought she could erase. And I had a weapon even more subtle than the law: timing. Patience allows you to see patterns. People reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. Claire, in her need to modernize, to control, to impose her taste, would walk straight into every contingency I had set. Each action she took would validate the strategy I had constructed. It was beautiful in its inevitability. I spent nights reviewing photographs of the house, studying the spaces, imagining every route she might take, every potential reaction. I visualized the moment the portrait, or anything tied to Alina, was accidentally threatened again. I planned my intervention with surgical precision. The letters would arrive, the clauses would trigger, the inheritance would revert, and Claire's own ego would be used as the final nail in the coffin. The more I planned, the more I realized how simple it would be, not because it was obvious, but because she had built it for me. Every step she took, every decision she made, was rooted in underestimating both history and consequence. And yet I couldn't rush it. That was the key lesson I kept reminding myself. A trap, however elaborate, only works if the prey walks into it naturally. If I moved too quickly, Claire might notice. She might consult a lawyer, or Daniel might intervene. Patience wasn't just strategy, it was the only way to ensure perfection. By the end of that week, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced since Alina passed. Not peace exactly, not relief, but readiness, awareness, control. The world had tilted slightly in my favor, and I knew exactly how to let gravity do the rest. For the first time since entering that house and seeing the empty wall, I felt centered again. The betrayal had been acknowledged, the foundation of revenge had been laid, and all that remained was the execution. The awakening wasn't about anger, it was about strategy, about seeing the game clearly, and knowing, deep down, that every move they had made had been exactly what I needed to win. I returned to the house the following week. This time, it wasn't a casual visit. I came prepared, armed with more than just a key. I had documentation, subtle leverage, and the quiet patience of someone who knew the rules better than anyone else in the room. The air felt different the moment I stepped inside. Claire was moving furniture again, carefully adjusting a lamp that had been relocated, humming softly, confident that her vision for the house was solidifying. Daniel was nearby, holding a box of new kitchenware, trying to look helpful while mostly observing. Neither noticed me at first. I didn't speak, I didn't move toward them. I let them continue, letting every action reinforce the inevitability I had set into motion. First step: legal positioning. I opened my briefcase, a small, unobtrusive one that looked like I might have just come from the office, and carefully laid out a few letters and notices. They were formal, yet polite. Each contained clauses from the will that directly tied to the portrait and other representations of Alina. I made copies, highlighted the key language, and organized them in order of execution. Nothing aggressive, nothing confrontational, just facts. Facts that would speak louder than any argument could. Next, the subtle psychological pressure. I began casually moving through the rooms, pointing out minor discrepancies. I noticed the painting in the hallway was shifted. Was that intentional? I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Clea stiffened, her fingers pausing on a lamp she was adjusting. Daniel didn't react. It's just decoration, she said, almost too quickly. We moved it to create space. I nodded, of course, but remember the clause regarding placement of all artistic representations tied to Elena. The words landed like stones in water. She didn't react immediately, but I could see the ripple. She glanced at Daniel, whose expression finally betrayed slight unease. Then I waited. Patience was my ally. The trick wasn't to confront aggressively, it was to let them act into the trap themselves. Clea made the next move. Later that afternoon, she removed a small sculpture from the mantel, a porcelain bust Elena had bought on a trip to Italy decades ago. She placed it in storage, convinced it would make room for a modern centerpiece. Perfect. I waited just long enough before stepping in. That's the bust I was referring to in the letter, I said casually, pointing. Since it's been removed without consent, the clause has already been triggered. The house, and all assets tied to it, revert as specified. Clea froze, her smile vanished, replaced by something else, confusion then fear. Daniel's face mirrored it seconds later. I continued, steady and controlled. You may not have realized it, but the clause is explicit. Every item, every representation is included. That means, legally, the inheritance associated with the house is back under my control, effective immediately. Clea's voice trembled slightly. You can't. I already have, I interrupted calmly. Everything is documented. And the lawyer confirms it. The execution is automatic. You forfeited your claim. Daniel tried to speak, to intercede, but I silenced him with a glance. He knew better than to argue at this point. Next, I reinforced the inevitability. I handed her one of the letters I had prepared. This outlines exactly how this unfolds. There's no discretion left to contest. It's automatic, binding, and immediate. She flipped through it, eyes widening, trying to understand the language she had ignored when she thought she was just moving decorations. I smiled faintly, not triumphantly, but with the calm satisfaction of inevitability. The house belongs to Elena's legacy, and as executor, it now belongs to me. Her posture stiffened, then she tried to regain control. We can fight this, Daniel and I. I cut her off with a quiet precision that left no room for argument. You walked into this trap yourself. Every action, every decision reinforced it. Your confidence became your undoing. The realization hit her like ice. Her face paled. Daniel's jaw tightened. They had thought they were in control. They had underestimated the rules, the history, and the foresight built into every line of that will. And now, every piece of furniture she had bought, every modification she had made, every attempt to modernize was irrelevant. She had acted, unaware that each step only strengthened the legal and symbolic claim of Elena's legacy. I paused, letting the weight of it sink in. Silence filled the house like thick fog. Clea's hands trembled slightly. Daniel stood rigid, and I, calm, measured, felt the satisfaction of a plan executed flawlessly. But the real beauty of this moment wasn't confrontation. It wasn't humiliation. It was inevitability. The house had already shifted back to the rightful place. Clea's ego, her manipulations, her assumptions, they had all acted as catalysts in a chain reaction she never understood. And the portrait, it didn't even need to be returned yet. Its absence had already done the work. In trying to erase Elena, Clea had ensured Elena's presence, and authority dominated the house in a way no mere painting could. Step by step, I watched them realize the consequences of their arrogance. Their world, carefully constructed over months, had crumbled quietly, efficiently, and without drama, exactly as it should. I thought the execution was complete. Clea's shock, Daniel's hesitation, the quiet tension hanging in the house, it was the perfect moment. A masterstroke of patience, strategy, and inevitability. I expected the next few days to be merely procedural. Lawyers confirming ownership, papers signed, and the house finally returning fully to Elena's legacy. But life, as it often does, has a way of introducing a complication you don't see coming. It came in the form of a letter, postmarked from an unfamiliar law firm in the next state over. I recognized the type immediately. Aggressive, precise, and the kind of communication designed to unsettle even the most composed executor. I opened it carefully, scanning the first line. This correspondence serves as notice that a claim has been filed against the property at 147 Maple Street, asserting prior rights to certain assets contained therein, including items classified as part of the Alina Whittaker estate. My fingers tightened around the paper. My heart slowed, not out of panic, but out of recognition. Someone had found a loophole. Someone had traced Alina's assets across a network of holdings I had thought were obscure enough to remain dormant. The letter continued, detailing an obscure clause buried in one of the earliest codicils to the will, an old trust Alina had set up for charitable contributions in the event of certain triggers being activated. It referenced conditions I hadn't even considered applying to property modifications. Essentially, Claire's removal of the portrait had activated a chain that simultaneously granted the estate to me and created a contingent interest for a charity. A charity I hadn't named. A charity that now had the potential to dispute the legal flow I had so carefully orchestrated. I reread the letter, scanning for errors. None. Every reference was precise, every clause accurately quoted. It was impeccable. For the first time in months, I felt the faint twinge of anxiety. Not fear, never fear, but awareness that the strategy I had executed flawlessly was now at risk of complication. The trap had been sprung perfectly, but what I hadn't anticipated was that Claire's action might trigger more than just her own downfall. I leaned back in my chair, letting the realization settle. Every scenario I had considered in my mental map of this revenge assumed human error, but this was different. This was structural, legal, and it could destabilize everything if I didn't act quickly. I made a decision immediately. Step 1, confirm the legitimacy of the claim. I called my lawyer. His voice, calm and measured, betrayed the slightest hint of surprise. You're correct, this clause exists. It's rarely triggered, but it can override the current executorship if properly contested. Step 2, assess leverage. Claire's panic had not yet reached this point. Daniel was still on the fence. I realized that I could use this unforeseen development to reinforce their understanding of the stakes, and to ensure that their attempts to manipulate the situation now worked against them. Step 3, plan the countermeasure. I needed to approach this carefully. A direct legal battle with the charity could drag on for years, unnecessary, messy, and unpredictable. But there was a simpler, subtler path. Demonstrate that the charity had no standing, using Alina's intent and the specific triggers she had designed to show that the reversion clause I had executed was both primary and absolute. Every action by Claire, every movement of objects, every step she had taken in her arrogance, now strengthened my argument. And yet the twist forced me to act quickly, methodically, and creatively. I couldn't simply rely on patience anymore. I needed precision. I returned to the house under the guise of routine, checking the property, reviewing the modifications. But in reality, I was observing, calculating, and preparing the next layer of execution. I documented every movement Claire made, every alteration she implemented, every statement Daniel offered, knowing that these would all serve as proof of intent and consequence in the unfolding legal framework. By the time they realized the existence of the charitable claim, I had already formulated the plan to neutralize it. I wasn't reacting. I was predicting. Every twist, every contingency, only reinforced the inevitability that had always been at the core of this revenge. And in that moment, I understood something crucial. Revenge, at its purest, isn't just about punishment. It's about control. It's about anticipation. It's about orchestrating outcomes so flawlessly that every surprise only plays into your hand. Claire thought she had rewritten history by removing a portrait. She didn't know she had triggered an even more elaborate, hidden mechanism. And by the time she did, it would already be too late. The first twist had arrived, and it only made the eventual victory even sweeter. The days following the first twist were a careful dance. Claire had discovered the charitable claim, and with it the tension between control and consequence intensified. I could see it in her every movement, the way she hesitated before touching a lamp, the way she peeked at Daniel for reassurance, the slight tremor in her hands when she typed emails. Confidence was a fragile thing, and hers was cracking faster than she realized. I maintained my composure. Calm, deliberate, almost invisible in the house, I observed, recorded, and let their own actions do the heavy lifting. Every hurried decision, every defensive gesture they made now served as proof of negligence and ignorance. It was ironic, almost poetic. They had believed the house could be controlled through design and appearances, but control is not aesthetic. Control is law, foresight, and timing. I called Daniel one evening, under the pretense of a casual conversation. We spoke about mundane things first, the city, the weather, small repairs needed around the property, but then I guided the topic subtly toward the house, the portrait, and the clause. You know, Dan, I said, keeping my voice light, Claire didn't realize that removing Alina's portrait triggered more than just the clause for ownership. The codicil also interacts with certain conditional trusts we've rarely had cause to invoke. She walked right into the sequence that Alina designed. Daniel froze mid-sentence. Wait, you're saying? I smiled faintly. Yes, legally the house is under my executorship, but there's a contingent interest that now has to be formally addressed before the charity can claim anything. And once it's addressed, the reversion becomes absolute. There's no appeal, it's inevitable. He didn't need more explanation. Daniel, for all his practicality, had always respected Alina's intelligence. He understood the rules immediately, and now more than ever, he understood how poorly Claire had assessed both history and consequence. The turning point came when I set the stage for the final confrontation. I didn't rush it. Instead, I arranged a series of formal meetings and notices, making Claire act. Each one of her responses, emails demanding justification, phone calls questioning authority, frantic discussions with Daniel, played directly into the strategy I had envisioned. She was unknowingly validating every argument I needed to cement my claim. The legal documents were impeccable, the letters precise. I even orchestrated a review by a neutral attorney I knew under the guise of clarifying procedural matters. That review only confirmed everything. Claire's removal of the portrait had triggered the clause. Her subsequent actions had reinforced it. She had no standing to dispute anything, and attempting to do so only made her case weaker. By the time I finally confronted her directly in the living room, the house had become a courtroom of its own. Every item she had moved, every decision she had made was evidence. Daniel, standing quietly beside me, no longer hesitant, watched as the realization settled on Claire's face. You planned all of this, she whispered, the first crack in her carefully constructed persona. I shook my head slowly. Not planned, Claire, anticipated. Every action you took was predictable. Every assumption you made was accounted for. Alina and I designed this house and her legacy to withstand attempts like yours. Her eyes darted to the empty space above the fireplace, then back at me. So, the house, it's yours. Legally, I said calmly, it's under my executorship. The clause has been triggered. The reversion is absolute, and any further attempt to remove, replace, or alter items tied to Alina's legacy will only reinforce it further. She sank into the armchair, deflated, realizing that the confident control she had assumed was nothing more than an illusion. Daniel didn't move to comfort her. He had seen the pattern unfold and now understood exactly how the house, and Alina's memory, had remained untouchable. For the first time, I felt the balance restored. The turning point wasn't about confrontation or shouting, it was about visibility. The villain realized, finally and irrevocably, that they were trapped. Every argument they might have made, every demand they could have issued, had been preempted by the structure of the clauses and the patience of their executor. Claire's ego, which had driven every reckless decision, now worked against her, and I stood quietly, watching inevitability do what it does best, unfold. By evening, the tension had settled into a subdued resignation. Claire no longer argued, she no longer moved freely. The house, once hers in appearance, had reverted to Alina's, and through her design it was mine to manage, to protect, and to enforce. The turning point wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was absolute. The moment she realized she was trapped, the subtle, precise orchestration of revenge reached its apex. And I knew the final twist was still to come. I had assumed that once Claire realized the reversion was complete, the game was over. I believed the turning point, the moment she understood she was trapped, would be the climax of her reckoning. But life and revenge are rarely so simple. The next morning, I received a call from the law firm handling the charitable claim. My calm demeanor during that conversation masked the shock that briefly tightened my chest. Mr. Whittaker, the attorney said, voice clipped, professional, we've conducted a thorough review of the charitable interest triggered by the codicil. Technically, your interpretation is correct, but there's a nuance we hadn't anticipated. The clause specifies that any reversion to the executor must consider intent of the decedent regarding public representation. Essentially, the portrait, and by extension Alina's presence, must be reinstated in a public, visible space for the clause to remain fully enforceable. Otherwise, the charity may have grounds to claim partial assets. I froze for a second, then smiled quietly. Claire had unknowingly handed me a new lever. By removing the portrait in her haste to modernize, she had triggered a secondary condition I hadn't anticipated, but one I could now exploit with precision. I could almost hear Alina's voice in the quiet of my apartment, that gentle, sharp clarity. Never let them forget the rules, dear. The second twist then was this. The law now required the very thing Claire despised, the portrait, to be returned to prominence. My revenge could take a new form, one more devastating than simple legal reversal. The portrait wouldn't merely reclaim its place, it would become the centerpiece of her humiliation, a permanent reminder that she had overstepped, miscalculated, and walked into a trap twice. I arrived at the house later that afternoon. Claire was tidying again, rearranging small items in an attempt to reclaim the sense of order she thought she'd achieved. Daniel was quietly helping, but there was tension in his posture. He had begun to sense the deeper layers of the plan I was unfolding. I entered the living room and, without a word, gestured toward the empty space above the fireplace. Claire's eyes followed mine, and for the first time there was genuine apprehension in her expression. "I've been informed," I said, voice calm, measured, "that the legal standing of the house now requires the portrait to be restored prominently. For the clauses to remain enforceable, Elena's image must be visible to anyone who enters. It's non-negotiable." Her face paled. "You mean put it back here, above the fireplace?" I nodded. "Exactly. Every removal, every attempt to modernize now works against you. The law, and Elena's intent, dictates that her presence dominates the space." Claire's confidence faltered. She glanced at Daniel as if to seek validation, but he remained silent. He understood the stakes. "Do you understand?" I asked, my tone still calm. "This isn't a suggestion, it's a legal requirement. Failure to comply could trigger further automatic transfers of assets." Her hands trembled as she reached for the portrait, carefully carrying it back to the fireplace. Every movement was deliberate yet heavy with resentment. The room seemed to contract around her. Every item she had installed in the name of modernity now seemed trivial in comparison. As the portrait was rehung, I noticed a subtle shift in the air, almost as if the house itself was exhaling, settling back into the shape it was always meant to hold. Elena's presence dominated once again, and Claire could not escape the symbolism. She had tried to erase her, failed, and was now forced to honor her in a way that was entirely unavoidable. The second twist was complete. What had begun as a legal maneuver became a psychological masterstroke. Claire's desire to modernize, to assert control, and to erase the past had ironically ensured her own public defeat. Every time she entered that room, she would be reminded that she had been outmaneuvered, bound by her own misjudgment and Elena's foresight. Daniel, watching quietly, finally spoke. I get it now. I didn't see it before." I nodded, acknowledging his understanding. The final phase was near, and this last twist ensured it would not merely be about legal victory. It would be about presence, symbolism, and poetic justice. The house, Elena's house, was once again in balance, but this time it was more than a return. It was a reminder, a living testament that arrogance, carelessness, and disrespect have consequences that are not only legal, but inescapably personal. Claire had underestimated the power of legacy, and now she would live with it every single day. The days that followed were quieter than expected, but far from uneventful. Claire no longer moved with confidence. Every time she entered the living room, she paused at the portrait, her expression a mixture of frustration, resignation, and grudging acknowledgement. She tried in small ways to reclaim her sense of control, rearranging a vase here, adjusting a lamp there, but the dominance of Elena's presence was absolute. Each minor alteration felt inconsequential against the weight of the portrait's return. Daniel observed silently. He didn't intervene, and his quiet acknowledgement of the situation created a subtle shift. Claire had expected her husband to defend her, to assert their joint control, but instead he was a passive witness, quietly recognizing the inevitability she had created herself. The imbalance was palpable. Meanwhile, I took subtle actions behind the scenes. Legal confirmations were sent to both Daniel and Claire's accounts, meticulously documenting each step and ensuring there would be no challenge to the reversion of the house. I didn't need to act aggressively. My presence, combined with the portrait and the formal notices, was enough to reinforce the new order. One evening, I returned to the house under the pretense of routine inspection. I walked through the living room slowly, deliberately, as if I were merely visiting. Claire hovered nearby, uncertain whether to greet me, to speak, to retreat. I didn't acknowledge her, only letting my eyes rest briefly on Elena's portrait. The effect was instantaneous. Claire flinched slightly, her hands tightening around the edge of a side table. She realized more clearly than ever that her attempts to erase the past had been futile. In her mind, she could still see the cascade of consequences triggered by her actions. The reversion of assets, the legal documentation confirming my authority, and now the portrait asserting its silent dominance over the room. Daniel finally spoke, breaking the tense silence. "Claire, I think it's time to accept it. This is how it has to be." Her response was barely audible. I see that now." The house itself had become the stage for the reversal of fortune. Every move Claire had made, every alteration she had attempted, had been absorbed into a larger narrative she could no longer control. What she thought was modernity and progress had only highlighted her error. And the portrait Alina's face, her calm, unwavering gaze, was the centerpiece of the reversal. It wasn't just symbolic, it was functional. Every legal clause tied to her representations now reinforced the truth Claire had tried to deny. She had overstepped, miscalculated, and been outmaneuvered. By the end of the week, the reversal was complete. Claire no longer attempted to assert control. Daniel had quietly ceded authority in recognition of the inevitable, and I had achieved what I had set out to do, not through confrontation, but through patience, foresight, and the precise orchestration of events. The house had reverted fully to Alina's legacy, my legal authority as executor cemented, and Claire's attempts to modernize or erase were now permanently framed as her own misjudgment. Every glance at the portrait was a reminder of the consequences of arrogance and disrespect. The reversal wasn't public. There was no shouting, no courtroom drama broadcast for neighbors to see. It was far subtler and therefore far more satisfying. In removing Alina, Claire had triggered a cascade that ultimately restored everything to its rightful place. The balance was restored, the legacy protected, and the house, Alina's house, once again reflected the order, respect, and intelligence it had always demanded. And as I stood in the living room one last time that evening, watching the portrait's calm gaze, I knew the final act was ready to conclude with the ultimate reminder. Sometimes, the most powerful revenge is the one that doesn't need to shout. I left the house that night, quietly closing the door behind me, letting the soft click echo through the halls like a punctuation mark. The air was still, the room's calm, the portrait staring down at a world that had underestimated it, and the woman it represented. Claire no longer moved with authority. Daniel had stepped back, finally seeing the truth of what had unfolded. The house, every room, every frame, every shadow was no longer hers to control. She had tried to erase Alina, to overwrite history with her own taste, her own sense of control. But history, like law, is patient, and when provoked, it responds with precision. I didn't gloat, I didn't revel in confrontation. I had no need to. The portrait alone said everything that needed to be said. Its calm, unyielding presence was a mirror reflecting Claire's mistake back at her every day. As I walked down the driveway, I paused for a moment, letting the night air brush against my face. The city was quiet, indifferent, but I felt a deep satisfaction rooted not in revenge itself, but in justice, quiet, inevitable, and flawless. Alina had been removed, disrespected, and underestimated, but through foresight, patience, and careful orchestration, her legacy had been protected, her presence restored, and those who had sought to diminish her had been left powerless in their own home. I smiled faintly, the last thought in my mind a simple one. She tried to erase her, but in doing so, she just made her immortal. And with that, I walked away.